The Executive Director of Citizens for Balanced Use out of Bozeman. We started in 2004 from the, actually started off the forest plan, travel plan out of the Gallatin on the closures, ultimately resulting in about 50% of our multiple-use motorized access gone. Just got elected for my fourth term in the Montana House of Representatives. I serve on Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, taxation, and this will be my third term as chairman of Natural Resource Committee, which is the oversight committee, or the bills in front of us are Department of Environmental Quality and Department of Natural Resource Conservation. They have a forestry division out of that, but it's also water. So Natural Resource Committee, we look at bills, everything coming out of the ground for water, and everything being discharged into the ground, including agricultural operations, mining, and everything like that. So over the last several years, what we have been concerned with in Montana is what we're breathing that Idaho and Oregon and Washington and California have been sending us in our air. We're downstream from you folks. So I've been looking at all the different problems and the fuel loads that we're experiencing out in the West. So this is not the Idaho Constitution, but I do have a copy of the Idaho Constitution here on the next slide. But this is Article 2, Part 2, Section 3, the Montana Constitution. And these are our inalienable rights, which they include the right to a clean and healthful environment, which in Montana we're not getting every summer for 2 or 3 or 4 months. The Constitution of the state of Idaho, and I had to look through it because you don't really have a clean and healthful environment in your Constitution that requires that. But under right of eminent domain, you have an interesting phrase here. Any other use necessary to complete development of the material resources of the state or the preservation of the health of its inhabitants is hereby declared to be a public use and subject to the regulation and control of the state. And I think what's important about this is the health of the people and the inhabitants in the state of Idaho comes under some jurisdiction of the state to be able to control what happens in your state so that your public has a healthful environment. So I want to go through a few laws that govern. These are federal laws. The mining law, accessible to mineral resources located on these lands are protected. The RS 2477, these are grants of right-of-ways to the states prior to when the Forest Service and the BLM were put into reserve, which in Oregon, which I just came from, working on a 3-forest forest plan revision of 6,000 pages, basically of garble. But I think it was a monumental event yesterday in Baker City, and if I've got time, I'll explain what happened. But it's essential to maintain this transportation infrastructure for the transportation of goods and services. These are right-of-ways granted to the states. The federal government has no authority over these, either Forest Service or BLM. These are state right-of-ways granted under RS 2477 and had to do with the 1872, which the Forest Service was put in reserve about 1905. So this predates the reserve of the Forest Service. The Organic Act, and this is why the forest was reserved, just 2 purposes, very, very simple. Favorable conditions for water and to ensure a continuous supply of timber. And the Forest Service is under the Department of Agriculture, not under the Department of Interior. Department of Interior was a land disposal agency, but the Forest Service was under agriculture because timber was a growing product, and they received receipts from that, and that benefited your local communities and your state. And they realized that in 1897 under the Organic Act, and then in 1905 through 1907, they started reserving the forest. The Taylor Grazing Act. The surface resources are just as important as other resources. Now, if you're going to graze on either BLM or Forest Service allotments. Grazing this and that surface resource for grazing is just as important as a frog or a beetle or a slug or anything else out there. But what's happened over the years is they're elevating the ecological concerns on the animals under the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, and they're discounting the Tailored Grazing Act. The Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, this was in 1960. Multiple use of resources that are provided to the people of the United States under the act must be upheld. And they're discounting that again. They're sliding that to the side and putting more emphasis on preservation, so to speak. The Wilderness Act. Everybody, we created wilderness, and we also have the Wilderness Study Act. That was in 1977, the Wilderness Act in 1964. The Wilderness Act set aside areas to be left unmanaged. But under the Act, I think that this gets kind of lost. We must ensure in future planning that other forest lands do not become de facto wilderness areas. All other public lands must remain under the management of the multiple use concept. But over the years, the wilderness has been, buffers have been created, or what they will do is the Forest Service or the management agencies will recommend wilderness areas in a forest plan or a land management plan from BLM. And then the agency will take it upon itself as a directive, a rule within the agency to actually manage these recommended wilderness areas as wilderness. And that's what's occurred. In the Gallatin where I'm at, mentioned, we run a cow-calf operation up there. My great-grandfather came there in 1864. We had a ranch on the Madison. We sold that in 1868 for 3 cents an acre, and we bought the place we're on now for 10 cents an acre. Irrigated hay. We run black cows. So the Mining and Mineral Policy Act of 1970 recognized the environmental concerns, recognizing the benefit of mining to this country and its people must remain paramount. And this is very important to Oregon and those areas with a lot of mineral resources, and we have them in Montana too. Access to these minerals is guaranteed to the people of the United States for the benefit of the United States. If these public lands do not allow for access, the resources contained therein will be removed for the benefit of all people. And this was in 1970. Endangered Species Act, and this is something that's ignored again. It has environmental laws, you'll see up here, but we must take care to ensure that cumulative effects of these laws do not prohibit the management of our resources for future generations. It is imperative that the aforementioned laws and any other laws that facilitate resource management be held to the integrity that they were intended. So it's in the laws and it's in the acts that we need to maintain access for these resources for the benefit of the people. It's just like water, but it's mineral, it's timber. So this is a picture that was taken in 2017, and this was the Lolo Peak Fire, where the federal government and the Forest Service allowed this to burn as they were monitoring it for 2 months. And then when it blew up, this little town right down here below is Lolo. It might as well be Paradise, California. That was a $34 million fuel reduction project. That's all it was. Drop in federal timber harvest. You can see federal forest land. That would be the brown line. About 1989, that's when we started seeing the drop in the timber harvest. You can see on private land, that's the green line. That stayed relatively, you know, if you're gonna grow timber, you're gonna harvest it every year, but private land cannot support the mills in and raw materials that they need. And consequently, we had 31 mills in Montana, we're down to 6. I was just in John Day, they got 1. Prairie City mill is closed. It's kind of in mothballs. I think Baker City has some mills, they have none. LeGrand has 1 mill left running half-time. Wallowa would love to get a mill. They don't have a mill left anymore. And yet the timber continues to grow, and consequently the fuel load grows. So if you take a look at this picture, you can see a private property owner and what he does with her land, and on the left is federal land. And in Montana, we are experiencing extreme bug kill because our forests have become so overgrown with trees, and every tree out there consumes water. And so when the environmentalists or people say, why are our stream flows so low? Why are the stream temperatures raising? Well, if you're taking water out of the stream by the trees, nothing gets to the stream. And also, when you get into these thick forests like that, it's called transpiration. The snow goes down and lands in the trees, doesn't get to the ground, and then it evaporates back into the atmosphere. And so you're not recharging your water. And my older brother's a hydrologist, worked for the state for a few years. He's a county commissioner in Gallatin County right now, which my dad was before that. But he explained to me many, many years ago, it's not surface water that recharges streams. It's the pressure of the groundwater under the stream holding the water in the stream. If you deplete the groundwater levels, you displace water in the streams. You look here, all the X's, the blue X's, light blue and dark blue, those are all the mills that have been closed in the United States, and since 1989. And if you look in the Northwest up here, there's not much left for mill capacity. You got Boise Cascade, you got Weyerhaeuser, you've got a few mills, but all of those are not running at full shift. I was down in John Day, testimony in front of the Forest Service there with the meetings that we were having. Crime rate up, highest unemployment in the state of Oregon. Drug, opioid abuse, jails full. A lot of complaints about guys beating their wives. They're frustrated. Suicide rate. It's because we've lost the jobs in rural America. Fires. Now you can track those back and you'll see that, basically the increase in wildfires has increased since the timber harvest has decreased. Our fuel loads are extreme. Timber harvest versus burned on federal forest. Same thing, as you see the timber harvest being reduced, millions of acres burned. And we've reduced our timber harvest about 8 to 10 billion board feet per year over the last 30 years. So you put that in context, 10 times 30, we have an excess of wood out there that could have been processed of about 300 billion board feet. I could put a lot of people to work. So what happens to this timber? Now this I took up in a drainage Stormcastle Creek. We have a cabin up there that my grandparents built in 1934. And we still have it today. We have a lease in holding in the Forest Service up there. But this is up at the head of the drainage, and this was a fire that went through there maybe 5-6 years ago. And you can see that I think about 25-30 years ago, they had a clear cut up there. This fresh, new growth of timber out there is not what's burning. It's the old timber that's there. So when these folks say that, timber harvest doesn't reduce the risk of wildfire, I beg to differ. I really do. And it's on the ground. You can see it. So what happens after the fire? You know, they had the fire down around Paradise down there and actually down around Malibu this summer. And then they had the rains that came in right after, and you saw the news reports. They're talking about major mudslides, erosion. So we bake the fish in the streams, and the ones that don't get baked, when the erosion and all the sedimentation goes into the streams, we kill the fish that way. This is a nice little drainage after a fire. All that mud and sludge down in the bottom of that. This is another fire. This is a few years after the fire. I mean, it does clean itself up, but what have you done to that stream, and what have you done to the bottom of that stream? Have you taken away those spawning beds and stuff by the material that you put in to those streams? And this picture was taken in 2004, and if anybody's familiar with the Blankenship Bridge up in the Flathead up there, you have the North Fork and the Middle Fork of the Flathead River. And if you've ever seen the Flathead River, it's just this blue, pretty blue stream. But the summer before, they had 3 fires up in this drainage. The Roberts Fire, the Wedge Fire, and the Moose Fire in those burned areas up there. So that spring, when that runoff, like I was talking about sedimentation, this is a difference between the stream that after a fire, the sedimentation, versus over into the Middle Fork where they had no fire. And you got to have that vegetation on the ground in order to prevent that sedimentation. And when those fires go through, it just bakes the ground. And it takes a long time for that ground to be able to actually soak up water. And again, you're reducing your groundwater recharge. Yes, sir?
Have you looked into how much mercury and arsenic released out of the soils in those areas?
Yeah. I'm gonna get to that one.
Is that later in your?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just telling you what's going on, but I want to get to the critical stuff, which is the smoke and stuff that's coming from the fires. Now, you might remember this was the Twist Fire. This is out in eastern Oregon. This several years ago. 2014, burned 100 homes. This is the aftermath of that fire. And so the USDA report, 10,000 miles of electric transmission lines. So there is an infrastructure problem because a lot of our electrical transmission lines go through federally managed land. This is a buddy of mine that lives down in Reed Point down there. We have a fire down there, the Jungle Fire Complex. He lost his home. This is his whole hay stack for the winter, but then he lost a lot of cows too in this. So when they say they want to protect the wildlife, well, this is what a fire does to wildlife. And it's not that the fire catches them and burns them up, it suffocates them. So they starve for air, they just collapse, and then the fire burns over them. And so, and this is livestock too, when you got grazing permits and stuff, horses. This is a photo, it's probably recognizable. It's actually a historic photo from the fires of '88 in West Yellowstone. And you know, in '88, we were sitting down there in Bozeman going shake and bake in '88. That was the big saying up there where we had, so. But anyway, we have pollution, 102,000 animals burned. I mean, if you burn 34 million acres, 102 million wildlife, I mean, when you burn that much acreage, you're burning up that much wildlife. No vegetation management, what you get is dirty air. And I worked on fires for 5-6 years for the Forest Service as a camp mechanic. That's my forte. I'm a certified auto tech, and so I was a camp mechanic, and the Fridley Peak fire blew up, and because of the terrain and everything, it blew up. It went up to 60,000 feet, and I was talking to some of the, you know, the atmospheric specialists or whatever, and they said once you get up into that high into the atmosphere, that particulate matter will circle the globe 2.5 times before it comes back to Earth. So I want to show you just some pictures of my neighborhood, which you guys are, you know, if you're burning it down here and you're upwind, I want to show you just this 26 miles east of us in Bozeman, Livingston. This is downtown Livingston in the middle of the day. So that smoke that's you guys in Oregon and California, it's coming our way. This downtown Butte. This is downtown Missoula. Now, between Livingston and Missoula, that's about a 300-mile distance. So I'm talking, you know, Montana's about 600 miles east to west. This is downtown Billings. Billings to Missoula is about 400 miles. So what we're talking is our entire state is covered with this smoke. So I took this picture off the internet. This is kind of interesting. This is downtown Sacramento when the Paradise Fire just happened this last summer, and then the one in Malibu. And so these folks are walking around with these masks, and so I got a kind of a prop here. You go down to the hardware store and you get a mask like this when you're pulling drywall out of your house. And it's just kind of a thin little mask. And then they do sell this other one as kind of a little bit heavier, thicker material. And it's N as in Nancy 95. So I don't know which ones these folks have on. They look like they came from the hospital or something, maybe the lighter ones. And I'll explain a little bit about these masks. So in 2013, the United States Department of Agriculture came out and did a report on wildland firefighter smoke exposure. And they wanted to look at what were the health effects of these fires on the firefighters. Now these are folks that are on the fire, but I just want to explain all of Montana might as well be a wildland firefighter all summer long. I just want to mention on some of this stuff that's in this report is some of the compounds in wildland fire smoke are confirmed carcinogens, cancer-causing carcinogens. Long-term health effects may include an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So this is a clip off the Department of Environmental Quality website for the state of Montana. And every day during the summer, we have air quality monitors all over the state of Montana. And so all of these will have a little dot, and they'll go all the way from, there's kind of a yellow at the bottom here, which is not on this chart here, and that's kind of moderate. But when you look at these little dots that they have on the TV every morning, there'll be, you know, kind of the orange and the red and the purple and then kind of a deep maroon. And I mean, it's amazing to me, but Department of Environmental Quality on our website in the state of Montana says hazardous causes premature mortality, very unhealthy premature mortality, unhealthy premature mortality, and you get down here unhealthy for sensitive groups. It actually, this screen is not quite showing it, but it's premature mortality. In other words, the smoke recognized by the Department of Environmental Quality in Montana is killing us. So this is, you know, just a few pictures of what we see in a fire in a mountainous terrain. I mean, around Boise and stuff, I think more so it's more of a prairie fire, grass fire, which is just as deadly. But this stuff is scary when it's coming at you. In this report, there's carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, aldehydes. They said, well, you know, you don't want formaldehyde in your house. You know, the old building materials in your flooring and wall. But yet we're breathing them every summer in this smoke. Alkaline, benzene, and I want to talk a little bit about this crystalline silica. That's what I want to talk mostly about. Crystalline silica is classified as a human carcinogen by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. A crystalline silica is the same stuff that's in mining dust. You've heard about asbestos up in Libya and Montana. That's crystalline silica. It's a very common compound contained in soil, and it's in trees, but it's a very fine particulate matter. It's less than 0.5 microns. And what's interesting about that is, and this is in a USDA report, what's in wildfires. So I was showing you this mass that's a little bit thicker than your typical drywall mask. But it says right on here, warning, does not protect you against crystalline silica. It goes right through this mask. And the thing about crystalline silica being so small, and why does it cause pulmonary disease, and why does it cause premature mortality with people with heart problems and respiratory problems, is because silica is kind of like mica. It's flat like glass, but it has a very sharp edges on it. And it is so small that it goes into your lungs. It doesn't come out. It gets lodged in your lungs. It's there forever. But it's so small it goes through your lungs and passes into your bloodstream. And now you've got crystalline silica particles in your bloodstream. And what it does to your heart, when it goes through your heart valve, it causes little lacerations in your heart valves in your heart. And that's how it can kill you with people with pulmonary disease and weak valves in their heart. Now, what do you do with crystalline silica? Okay, so I'm an auto mechanic, I'm not a body man, but these are the paint masks that you get when you're painting a car. And this is a 3M 5301 filter that will come on these paint masks. And it protects you from paint fumes. But when you read the long list of stuff that this will not protect you against, on the list is crystalline silica. It goes through this paint mask. Well, those folks in Sacramento, even if they were wearing this, wouldn't work. So you buy the paint mask, and then you go down and you get the 3M 6001. You get the 6001 filter, then you clip on the little pre-filter that goes onto that, like that, and then you attach it to that mask. You take the 5301 off and put the 6001 on. If you don't want to get that crystalline silica in your lungs, everybody needs to be wearing one of these, because that's the only way you're going to stop it from getting into your lungs. And believe me, I wear it sometimes. The smoke gets so bad. I will tell you, Seeley Lake had that maroon for over 30 days in 2017. You couldn't see across the street. I had the head of the health department for the Department of Environmental Quality testify in front of my Natural Resource Committee. I asked him about Seeley Lake. I said, how many days? He said over 32 days of that dark maroon in Seeley Lake. But he said it was kind of deceiving. He said because our air monitors only go to like 120 parts per million before it gets to that hazardous. He said Seeley Lake had 6 days over 900 parts per million, 8 times what the hazardous was. So this is a couple of fires. This one on the right, this is a fire right before it hit Paradise in California this last summer. This one on the left, that's the fire when it was coming into Malibu. So these are from last summer. I pulled these off the internet. It's pretty good depiction of what the size of these things are when they're coming at you. So intermediate chemicals in this same report from USDA. Mercury. Harmful substances released through this burning, but she says that mercury is the worst. Scientists estimate that fires in the continental U.S. and Alaska release 44 metric tons of mercury into the atmosphere every year, according to this 2007 study. Now, if the fires are getting worse and we're burning more ground, it's getting worse. So I would venture to say it's a little bit more than 44 metric tons every year. So again, Department of Environmental Quality tell us that it's causing premature mortality. We know it's killing us. And we know where fires are getting bigger because our fuel loads are not being reduced by logging. And so this is what's happened to our forest. And this is what it looks like afterwards. And we know that the sedimentation is going into the streams and rivers along with the mercury. So I was looking at what the Forest Service was planning to do to help us. This was the chief's letter of intent for wildland fire, dated April 2nd, 2018. Now, what are they planning on doing? It says here, we should use wildfire to achieve the desired ecological conditions. That's interesting. Didn't say anything about logging. And we're only going to extinguish the fire when needed. That means when it's going to burn down our homes and towns and property, they're going to put an engine out there and try to put something out. Well, I just want to remind them that, I'm going to back up just a little bit. You tell me how you're going to put that fire out. You don't. Unless you get on initial attack, you're not going to put it out. So, gotta get my buttons right here. Technology is awesome. So I want to draw your attention to something that I think is very concerning to me. I came across this that was published in August of 2018. So this is brand new, right off the press, about 3 months ago. And I would encourage everybody to look at this. And this came when the new chief, Vicki Christensen, now she's the head of the Forest Service now in Washington, D.C., under Secretary Perdue. And this is toward shared stewardship across the landscapes and outcome-based investment strategy. And I want to show you what they want to do to Montana and Idaho. You'll notice the green sections on this map, and this is on page 17. The green sections are improve forest health and resiliency while generating forest products to sustain rural communities. They're going to log it, they're going to provide jobs, material and products for sale. But look what the blue says. Create fire-resilient forest mosaics within conservation reserves using prescribed fire and managing unplanned ignitions. In other words, we're not going to put it out. We're going to let it burn, and if it doesn't burn like we want to, we're going to light it on fire. I want you to notice where the blue is. It's everything in my neighborhood, and it's everything in your neighborhood. They're going to burn Montana and Idaho, and they're going to harvest trees in the Sierras, maybe the Cascades. And what's interesting to me is the Forest Service chief before Vicki was Tony Took, and he decided to step aside because of some stuff. But I want you to see what's going on in Colorado. It looks like Colorado wants to harvest, okay? And I believe Vicki Christensen might have been a state forester out of Colorado. Okay, now I'm gonna take care of my little state, but I'm gonna burn the hell out of yours. So I was out in Oregon, and I met with Chris French, who's the Undersecretary of Agriculture under Purdue. Very nice gentleman, very smart. I think he's a good guy, and I think he's getting a handle on things. And I showed him this, and he just shook his head. He said, "Kerry, that's not where we're going. Really, it's not. Really, we're not." I said, "Well, I don't know what to tell you, Chris, but it says your agency is going there." And I put it on his radar very seriously. So if they're gonna burn us up and they're not gonna create the jobs and we're gonna have the fire, then we're going to experience health problems. That's my point about this whole thing. And this is not a Democrat issue. This is not a Republican issue. This is a people issue. This is the health of the human population. So they're either gonna burn us out, you know, or you can carry it out, one or the other. You know, and I was out in John Day, I saw 2 logging trucks go through town. You get on the highways, I remember in Montana, logging truck after logging truck when they were hauling logs out. It just doesn't happen anymore. And the logs that are coming out of there are these little 6 to 12-inch logs.
And they're both low mileage trucks.
Yeah, right.
And most of them are coming out from private.
John Day is hauling, or I should say, I'm sorry, LeGrand Mill is hauling logs 600 miles to their mill just to keep their people working. But that's not sustainable when they're looking out their door at all those big logs out there. I remember when I was a kid and we go on vacation, my mom was kind of raised in Tacoma, Washington out there, and I'd go by some of those times out there and there's one log on a truck. And I was just, wow. I don't think we're going to haul out that big of logs anymore because the mills have tooled themselves not to do the big 35-inch logs, can't do the 28-inch logs. The mill, Buck with the miller in LeGrand said the biggest log they can do is 24-inch. He said there's some mills that are still doing that, but because of the reduced timber size, these mills have adapted to that and reduced their size so that they can treat it. They just can't debark them, the big logs like they used to. So anyway, that's all I got. I'd be happy to answer any questions anybody might have. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Yes, sir.
Do you think that the closing of the mills in Idaho is what caused the wanting to burn instead of harvest?
I think it's the other way around. I think they reduced the harvest, which reduced the ability for the mills to be able to get the product in order to mill, and they couldn't support, you know, the wages and all of the things in the mill, and so they just closed up. And you know, I talked to some folks in some big operations. You know, I'm not gonna. Well, there's not that many left. You know, but Boise Cascade Warehouse or Plum Creek is a big one. You know, and I asked them. I said, so if we were, you know, is there money out there to invest in the wood products industry, like come back into Montana? And he told me there's millions of dollars, if not $1 billion of investment capital would come back in there. But in order to write a business plan, you've got to have guaranteed supply for 20 years in order to have the business plan. So unless the Forest Service creates the guaranteed supply of lumber over that, or timber logs over that period of time. And those companies also told me, just get us the material, we'll develop the market. It can be fertilizer, it can be wood chips, it can be pulp, it can be pig feed, it can be, I mean, the uses of this timber in the new technology age is tremendous.
You look at the news, and the news blames it all on global warming.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's an aftermath. Yes, sir.
Have you done any studies on the economic loss when we have the smoke? Because a lot of the farmers were telling me when we have the extreme smoke that their alfalfa won't grow, their different crops won't grow because the sun can't get through the smoke to the crops.
I do not have any information on that. I work with the stock growers and the Farm Bureau up in Montana. I have not heard of any studies like that. I have talked to some equestrian folks, and they won't ride their horses and stuff. We've got cattle that are not as active because they do that in the stock industry and stuff. The economics for jobs lost and those spin-off jobs related to, you know, the timber industry. Buck was telling me the amount of money that the timber employees are making, but it's way higher than in the service industry, you know, in your fast food places and you know, your motels and hotels and stuff like that. So we might have a lot of people working, but they're not making as much money. Yes, sir.
You go back to about 88, 89 in the precipitation of the closing down of the mills and the lumber industry. I was in a lumber town in 81, 82, 83 when I saw it begin. And it was all based on a fallacious story that the spotted owl had to have an old growth timber to make a nest in. Fallacious, fallacious, fallacious.
I think the bull,
And
was
3 out
it
of
the,
4 of our mills were all closed down, and 1 molding mill stayed open. And
Yeah.
that was it.
yeah, I think they found out it was a predator owl that was taking out the spotted owl, and what really wasn't the timber industry.
Absolutely. So anyway, so 82, 83 as far back as when I
Right.
watched people going broke.
Right. Do you have a question about that?
Or maybe it comes to Kerry. What's the possibility of getting a copy of this program?
Sure.
To me. I've been a registered nurse for over 30 years. I work in emergency trauma as my background. And since these fires have become more catastrophic over the years, and not just catastrophic wildfire, but controlled burns, I've seen a major increase in use for our emergency rooms, especially with people that have already compromised, whether it be lung disease, heart disease, immunosuppression from cancer. I have called our regional forest service out multiple times when we put the damn things out, because I can't take care of people that are hitting my emergency room.
Right.
And my business partner here and I, we lost in the Candy Creek complex out of John Day, which is 140,000 plus acres. We lost 3 homes, almost $1.5 million in timber and property. And the fire started almost 25 miles away. The health effects just from burning our houses, our cars. This was 3 years ago, but I'd like to put a public health thing together. That's what prompted me to run for office. Unfortunately, I got elected. This is something I would like to bring to the forefront.
You bet. I give you a whole copy of this. It's quite large on a PowerPoint, so if you have a stick, memory stick or whatever, I'm sure Zach has the technology to transfer it over there, or he can download it on his computer and get it, or, you know, be able. I will mention on the Canyon Creek, I appreciate you bringing that up, because the only thing that saved that from being paradise was the wind switch.
And our property, it stopped on our property where it was the forest was made, or where the timber was made.
Our management stopped it.
Stop the fire.
One side till the wind turned around.
I was talking to some folks down at John Day when I was down there, and your brother Glenn, who's the sheriff down there, a good friend of mine, he's talked about that. Yes, sir.
What, since about 1985 and 89, along that period, when our forestry on federal land really fell off, what have been the economic effects of that? Are we still using as much wood in this country as prior to this?
Well, what?
And if not, where did the wood come from?
What happened was that when we depress our resource industry, whether it be mineral and mining or timber, something fills the gap. And so if we don't develop our resources, we're going to get them somewhere else. And if we shut down our mining for precious metal for, say, our national defense, we're going to be dependent on China or Russia or some other country for the materials in order to get, to put that. So when we depressed our timber industry, what we saw was an influx of soft wood coming out of Canada. And there was a huge discounted price on that timber coming down because Canada, understand, is subsidized government logging. It's not private enterprise, so to speak. Now, those are in trade negotiations and stuff, and I think that expired on that trade deal. But understand a lot of that, you know, Canada just went to town trying to get that beetle kill under control. But they're running out of timber themselves up there because they've just massively tried to get that disease under control. It's like when I talk to the timber industry, they say, just give us a product, we'll develop the market. There is a market out there. But when the other side says, oh, the timber industry's depressed, there's no, you know, there's no demand for timber, you can do so much with timber, not only building houses. But I mean, everything here is wood product for the most part.
Well, the big thing to me is watching the railroad train, a freight train going down the road through downtown Denver. And 3/4 of the cars are loaded with finished studs, or 2 to 6 or something.
Yeah.
But it's in, I'd say 80% of it is Canadian sourced. And I'm wondering, I'm just
Yeah.
wondering, I know that NAFTA is probably a dead horse right now, and new agreements are being made.
It was just signed yesterday morning.
I know, but
Yeah.
what I'm suggesting here is that we decided to placate the use of our natural resources and ship it all basically in the timber industry to Canada. And I hate, you know, I wound up spending a lot of time in Canada after the timber industry shut down in Idaho. I went
Yeah.
up there to conduct operations. And
Sure.
The net result is that I find it very ironic that we don't have the guts to use our own.
I would call it litigation and analysis paralysis. Yes, ma'am.
If you have if you want to, do something, you know, about this and let somebody know, it's been my experience that 1 or 2 people, you know, they always say, write to your congressman. Is there any organized, organization that a citizen can work through or whatever to get this to the right people? I mean, in numbers, I mean, 1 or 2 people, like I said, aren't gonna make a difference. But if you have an organization, oh, Johnny on the spot, okay.
Check that out.
I
And
will.
my phone number and the website and email is all on there.
Okay.
We do everything that, you know, we can, and there's other organizations, multiple use organizations that are out there. You know, so, yes, sir.
Yes, I had a question, you kind of hit the nail on the head there. We see a lot of these projects get started, for instance, Fayette National Forest recently tried to do a 90,000 acre thinning project, but they're tied up in court now, and the mill is laying off people right before Christmas. Why are we paying these people to sue us? Who is going to repeal the Equal Access to Justice Act?
Yeah, that's an interesting deal. You know, Senator Daines out of Montana is our senator. We just re-elected John Tester. I apologize for that. Representative Greg Gianforte is our lone congressman. And Trey Gowdy put him as the chairman of the forestry subcommittee. And myself and Bill Harvey out of Baker City went out to Washington, D.C. And testified in front of his committee. And they're looking at trying to reduce the award settlement amount under the Equal Access to Justice Act, first of all. We did do away in the Department of Interior with the sue and settle, and the video that you just saw before has some stuff to do with that. There was just a ruling out of the court that said you couldn't designate critical habitat without that animal being in that habitat, because they were designating critical habitat because the animal could be there. So the Endangered Species Act, and then the other thing that you got to understand is that we are in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. So when you go to federal court and you lose because you're a timber company or whatever and you want to do a project, then you appeal to the Ninth Circuit, and you know, maybe those guys, you know, breathe a little bit of smoke, maybe they'll change their mind or something, but we are in a very liberal court situation. Now, somebody told me the other day, and somebody might have some information on that, that told me there's 5 appointments coming up in the 9th Circuit. And so the great thing about that is because under the Trump administration, he's put a lot of judges in place, a couple on the Supreme Court, but they're not gonna hear a timber case, so to speak. But he's put a lot of judges on the bench, and we did lose the House to the Democrats in the election, but the House has nothing to do with confirmation on the judge appointments. So we've got 53 votes in the Senate that will be able to confirm, hopefully, those new judges going forward. So I'm hopeful and I'm optimistic, but we don't require a bond. I mean, if the environmentalists put a stamp on an envelope and appeal, the judge puts an injunction on it or whatever like that, there is no bond required to compensate the value of that timber as it diminishes while it's in court.
I have one more part to that. Are you familiar with the settlement that the Indian tribes have with the power administrations and their $300 million budget and how they use that?
I am not. I am familiar with some of the water compacts, and I heard the judge dismiss the challenge on the Blackfoot.
This happened in the 1960s, and when you pay your power bill, 10% of your power bill goes to the Columbia River Intertribal Council. And what they do, if you guys don't know, man, the administrator for a group called Idaho versus USFS. So if you guys have seen some of that posted on there.
I go to that site a lot. It's a great site.
I've written a couple of articles. One of them was for the Forest Service. They recently closed Sugar Creek Road, and they didn't announce it to the public. They went up there and they said this road is hereby closed. The county sued. The county runs a budget shortfall every year and doesn't have the funds to fight it. It is an RS 2477 right of way. But the Nez Perce Indian tribes have spent millions of dollars to keep that road from ever being open to the public. And they take that $300 million that we pay them every year, and they go up there and they landlock these private landowners, and then they turn around. If you saw one of the things that I posted on there, it's an incident involving the Davis Ranch. They closed the only access road to the Davis Ranch, which was built by Norman Willey, who was the first governor for the state of Idaho. And they said that an 8-mile long hiking trail is reasonable access to your property. Oh, by the way, we'd like to buy your property. And these people are getting very elderly. They're having a hard time walking that 8 miles. But this money is getting used. They went back there and they landlocked 7 landowners. And the Forest Service actually proposed using eminent domain. They weren't going to give these people a choice. They were just going to buy all their property because they're on the other side of the creek, and they weren't going to let them cross that creek. And these people are very well politically connected. They decided that that wasn't going to be a reasonable venue. So the Forest Service and the taxpayers of Valley County and the Indian tribes built a $1.3 million bridge to access 7 properties. And they have money for that, but they can't spend $70,000 to restore a bridge on Sugar Creek Road.
I'm optimistic that that will start to change under this administration. I am. I really am.
The Power Administration has a lot of say over those funds, and they get that money every year, and they have to use it or it goes away. And
Sure.
they're using it to target and to force people out of their properties.
Well, yesterday, I will say, you know, if I have time, I don't know what my time deal is.
You're right.
I'm okay. So, there's a forest plan going on revision down in Mulherrin, Umatilla, and the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest. And I've been engaged with those folks for the last 14 years. I help them, educate them on NEPA, the process, commenting, the old appeal period process under the 82 planning rule. And then now we move to the 2012 planning rule and the objection process versus the old appeal rule. They had over 750 appeals under the old rule, under the travel plan. Monica Schwalbach couldn't review all of those appeals and meet with the appellants, and so she remanded the decision, and now the Forest Service has come back. They've consolidated all three forests, and they're gonna shove it down their throat with 6,000-page document with a 60-day appeal period. And so I went back down there this summer and helped everybody write appeals. They generated 340 objections. And the Forest Service was just overwhelmed. They just couldn't believe there would be 340 objections on this 6,000-page document on the three forests down there. So I went down for the objection hearings, and that's why I was down there. They had 5 objection hearings, John Day, Pendleton, Wallowa, Baker City, and LeGrand. And I went to John Day, Wallowa, and Baker City. LeGrand is happening today. But yesterday at the meeting was very interesting in Baker City. You had over 100 people, objectors, and they had to break it into 3 objection deals with Undersecretary under Purdue sitting in front of all of them. And the head guy is Chris French. And I got a letter from Sonny Purdue, because I told him, I said, I got a problem out here, Sonny. And he said, oh, I've got confidence in Chris French, and he's gonna take care of this for you. But if he doesn't, if you got any questions or concerns, you give me a call. I said, okay, so Chris is there, and he's a very nice gentleman, and I really believe this guy is trying to straighten that whole department out. So in the middle of the meeting yesterday, he said, I want to ask a favor of everybody. He said, I want you to excuse me for about 10 minutes, and then I'll come back. So he got up with the new Region 6 supervisor, Glenn Casamati, or whatever his name is. No, whatever, Glenn. And a guy by the name of Randy, who is the liaison between the Department of Agriculture, actually Forest Service, and NACO, National Associations of Counties, and Tom Montoya, I think of Montoya, is it? Yeah. Wallowa Whitman, Forest Supervisor on the Wallowa Whitman. They all get up out of the room, and they head off into the back room. We're just like, well, I don't know what's gonna happen. So they come back, and Chris comes back, and he sits at the table, and Glenn is sitting next to him. He's always been in the audience, but now he's sitting next to him. And he says to everybody in the audience, he says, we have really let you down. We have ignored the social economics of these rural communities in this plan. We have ignored the livestock grazing component, the fire, the fuel reduction projects. We have ignored so many things in this plan. And he says, I want Glenn here to talk for a minute. So he turns it over to Glenn, and Glenn was a little bit nervous. But anyway, he says, I just want to say to the commissioners, and Susan Roberts was there, she's a commissioner out of Wallowa, and Bill Harvey was there, Mark Bennett was there, some commissioners from some other counties, and he just wants to say, we have excluded you from the process, and this will not happen. He said, I am committed to coming back and sitting down with the counties and asking you what you need done in order to provide the socioeconomics within your counties, what needs to be done. And to me, that was a monumental point in what's going on in Washington, D.C. and directives coming back. And I will say, Tom Montoya, when he came out of that room, Mike Ragsdale, a good friend of mine who runs a glass shop down in Baker City, said, did you see his face? I said, no. He said, it was as red as my shirt. I think he just did not want to accept what Chris French was telling him, that we have let these people down. I think that there's stuff turning around, but there's pushback from both parties. There's pushback within the deep state that's in there that's not allowing these things to go, you know, as fast as they could. But I think that we're turning the corner here, and I'm optimistic. And I think what happened in those forests, there will be a directive coming out of Washington, D.C. I talked to Chris afterwards. And what he told me is right now they are writing a coordination guidelines or handbook for the Forest Service to explain to the Forest Service what they need to do in coordinating with the local counties. I'm very optimistic about that coordination. There's one other problem in the Forest Service, and it was mentioned at another meeting that I went to. And this was to try to expedite the NEPA process. And it was held in Missoula. And everybody in the room said that the biggest problem within the Forest Service is the turnover of employees. They're only there 3, 4, 5 years, and then all of a sudden they're gone. And the gal there, Gina Higgins, she says, there's nothing we can do inside the Forest Service. But I mentioned that to them down there in Baker City. And I told them that they need to try to give advancement incentives for people to stay in an area so that the people get to know. Because during the meetings, Chris French was going, well, who do we contact? How do we know? And so I told Chris during the meeting, actually it's all recorded, so it'll be public record or whatever. I said, if you had people in the agencies that actually lived and stayed in the district and worked there for 15, 20 years, and you had a problem, you would have the guy's number or the gal's number to call. You would know the people. But there's a mentality inside of the federal agency is don't go native. In other words, do not get to know the people you're making decisions for, because it's very hard to make a poor decision or a bad decision or a hurtful decision to those people that you know, but it's very easy to do with somebody you don't know.
It's also easy to burn up the land around you if you don't really care about it.
Exactly. Yes, sir.
There used to be a guy that still exists inside the agency that I've been involved with now for years. Now, you don't promote in the Forest Service unless you're willing to transfer.
Exactly.
Not off district, not saying forest, off forest. You have to
Exactly.
move from one to the other, or you go
Yes.
hand in hand. You
That's
go
right.
there in grade.
Yes.
You get the promotion after you arrive. Does
Yes.
that still exist? Because if it does.
That, well,
One of the problems.
yeah. Jody Sutton out of Washington DC, who was kind of the facilitator, kind of brought this whole meeting together. I was talking to her about that. And she said that is the number one issue that they're looking at in Washington DC right now, is how in order to advance within the Forest Service and the federal agencies, you gotta move. And so it is right there on their radar. She told me it's top of the list. Now, will something happen? I mean, you can't prevent somebody from wanting to move to another town, or anything. But if they had an incentive, and I told the story to Chris French down there in the public meeting and stuff. I showed you that drainage up there where that fire burned in Stormcastle, and I told you I had a cabin up there. My grandfather skidded the logs by horseback, 1934. My grandmother hand peeled all the logs and built the cabin and stuff. I remember going up there, and I was actually up there when the earthquake happened in 1959 in Quake Lake, which I would remind you, I've got 5 families up in Alaska, and I've been in contact with 2 of them. They don't have power, they don't know when they're gonna get power back, but they did survive. They had a 7-point earthquake yesterday morning up in Anchorage. But anyway, back onto the ranger would come down there. I remember 8, 10, 12 years old. The ranger would come by with a horse and a pack horse with him, all packed up, and he'd say to my grandfather, he'd say, Bud, would you keep your eye on the forest for 4 or 5 days? He said, I'm gonna run up to 320 Ranch up Buffalo Horn, and he said, I'll be back probably 4 or 5 days. That was the ranger for the forest asking my grandfather to keep an eye on things. My granddad knew him by name, but that was the community that we worked on, taking care of the forest. When we took away that community within the Forest Service and the BLM agencies and turned them into almost an armed militia sometimes against us, and we lost that. So, I'd taken enough time. Any more questions? Thank you very much.
They're supposed to serve lunch right in here, have they took the time?
Yeah,
Supposed to be.
please do. Yeah, it's pretty big, but you got one yesterday. He's gonna do.
We're gonna have, basically let everybody, the restrooms are right around the corner, let everybody get their lunch, you get settled in, and as soon as Angus is done, we'll kind of have a working lunch, as soon as Angus is done, we're gonna turn it over to him and let him start. Does that sound good?